This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Hey, here we go. Welcome to Marriage Unhindered. I'm your host, Doug Hinderer, licensed marriage and family therapist. You're probably going to want to take out a piece of paper and a pencil and jot down some notes because we're going to talk about how to navigate conflict between you and your spouse. No doubt about it, this is a stressful time of year, and I think that's kind of unfortunate. I mean, this should be a time of great peace and quiet preparation for the holiest day of the year. But it's not. It's not our culture. It's not our society. It's not the world we're living in. A couple's guide to handling conflict. And again, this is a blog written on the Gottman website by John Beatty. So he starts off, after we got married, my wife Tammy and I had our first holiday conflict over whose family to spend Thanksgiving with. Tensions flared as we defended our positions. 5 hours of freeway separated our families. So that's kind of tough. Not like you can get to both places on the same day. Tammy is an only child. She couldn't imagine her parents enjoying Thanksgiving without her. Makes sense. My parents were divorced, but I had shared Thanksgiving dinner with my dad and grandparents for the last several years. My younger brother had moved away to be close to our mother. I felt responsibility to spend Thanksgiving with my dad. Holiday stress can make this time of year challenging for couples and families. Dr. John Gottman's research on thousands of couples reveals some useful tools to handle conflict and keep your holidays happy. All right, so this is where you want to start taking notes, I think. Number one, accept your partner's influence. So let me just start off with a couple of scriptural quotations here to put this thing in perspective, right? So 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, okay? So encourage, build each other up. Philippians 4:5, let your gentleness be evident to all, right? So be gentle as you're accepting and listening to your partner's influence. Accepting your partner's influence will help to avoid escalating conflict. Dr. Gottman has learned that women tend to be better at accepting influence than men, but men who learn how to listen to and respond to their partner's influence stand to benefit with happier and longer-lasting marriages than those who don't. His research showed that men who do not accept their wife's influence have about an 80% chance of divorce. That's a pretty significant factor right there, right? So if you kind of want to divorce-proof your marriage, gentlemen, start accepting influence from your wife. Now, I think there's a scriptural basis for that as well. If you go back to Genesis, God looked down at Adam and said, not good to leave that boy alone. He's going to get in too much trouble. He needs some help. I will create for him a helpmate. And then God created a woman. So why didn't he create another guy who could, help Adam like build a barn or plow a field or watch football on Sundays? He didn't do that. He created a woman radically different in so many ways. And then he said to the woman, go help the boy. The boy ain't going to be able to do this by himself. Your job is to help him. And so when us husbands, accept help, accept influence from our wives, we're actually kind of doing it the way God intended it right from day one, okay? So, gentlemen, if you want to be happy, accept influence from your wife. And I think that's a really, really important point. And I remember some advice I got from a spiritual director early in my marriage. I was complaining about something. Who knows what that was? But he looked at me and he said, son, if it's not a sin, give in. What do you care? Right? If it's not a sin, you can't compromise an area of sin. Outside of that, give in. Give her what she wants. Keep her happy. What's the big deal? It's like, well, when you put it like that, I guess I kind of get the message. All right. So Mr. Beatty goes on. There's a good reason for men to listen. Results of an American Psychological Association survey show women are more likely than men to report increased stress during the holiday season. That makes sense, at least in my family. I mean, 98% of the burden falls to my wife's shoulders. Sources of stress include lack of time. My wife and I actually had that conversation just a couple hours ago. Lack of money and pressure to give or receive gifts. The results of increased stress can make a woman feel sick and tired and lose interest in intimacy. Help reduce your wife's stress, accept her influence, ask her what you can do to make her life easier. All right, Beatty goes on. A couple who listens to each other and takes into account each other's wishes and feelings when making decisions will have much happier holidays. Look for the parts of your partner's point, your spouse's point of view that makes sense to you. Even if you disagree, consider each option from his or her perspective and then validate those emotions. One of the most important words you can say is, wow, I can see how you would feel this way. I think, that says, validate the fact that, yeah, you're stressed out. It makes perfect sense to me that you would be. And then you follow it up with, what can I do to help you? Okay, how can I be of service to you? All right, so that's first thing, accept your partner's influence. All right. Number 2 is solve your solvable problems. That implies that there are unsolvable problems as well. And in fact, Gottman's research shows that only 29% of the conflicts you and your spouse have are solvable. So let's just round it to 30%, which means 70% of your problems you're not going to fix. That's a little scary, but, what Gottman found was that couples tend to be arguing about the same stuff 50 years after they get married. Well, that's it. That's just the deal. That's life. So there you go. All right. So, but there are 30% you can fix. The question is, how do you know what's in the 30% and what's part of the 70%? Well, generally you don't until you try to fix it. And if you can fix it, well, then it's in the 30%. And if you can't, well, then it's in the 70, right? So the choices couples face around the holidays can create situational problems that are solvable. Children may insist on gifts that aren't affordable, or an invitation to an event may conflict with other plans. So a lot of these things have got solutions to them. Gottman has identified a model for solving these solvable problems. The skills needed can be learned with very little training. Most of us have these skills already. This is where you might want to start taking some notes on these steps because they're kind of important. Step 1, soften your startup, right? So when you begin the conversation, you want to come at it softly. Conflicts end the way they start. So if you come in hot, it's not going to end well, right? It's only going to get hotter. Anger begets anger. So when there's a conflict, you want to talk about it before the emotions start running high, okay? I encourage, you're going to hear me say this a million times, but I think it's that valuable. Use the formula, the 3-step formula. I feel, when you, and I'd like to ask you to please, right? So I feel worried and anxious when you come home late and don't call, and I'd like to ask you to please call if you're going to be late. Use the formula, but formula starts with the I words, and I feel. The reason the formula works and is so powerful is because, listen, I want to be the perfect spouse. I don't want to hurt you. And if I've done something that's hurt you or offended you, I want to know about that so I can stop doing it. And if you could tell me that in a gentle way that doesn't criticize me or make me feel, like I'm stupid or something, I'm more likely to listen and say, oh, wow, yeah, I didn't intend to hurt you, and I see how that could happen, and I'll change. Okay, so start softly, use the formula, start with the I words, I feel in this situation, all right? Step number 2, learn to make and receive repair attempts, all right? So the idea here is to be able to call the time out, or come back later when you've all calmed down, okay? So that you can, the idea is come back, wait till you get to the point where you can actually talk about the conflict without getting back into it emotionally, where there's a little distance there and you can talk about it from a distance, okay? Use the formula again, but then talk about the trigger. So healing or repairing after the fight, there's an extra step in there called the trigger. So I was feeling lonely when you did this, and that triggered in me thoughts of other times when I've been rejected, or times when my father would laugh at me when I burnt the brownies, or when my mother would scold me if I did something wrong, right? So what's the trigger? What's the history? Why did that thing that your spouse do upset you? What's the history behind that? Is there a story behind that? Okay. And then tell them what you'd like them to do different. Okay. So the idea is to be able to come back and talk about it, but use the formula again as the model for how to have that conversation. Number 3, soothe yourself and each other. So call a timeout when you need one. A timeout is really okay. Now, there's a right way to do a timeout, and there's a wrong way to do the timeout. The wrong way to do the timeout is say, hey, I'm done with this conversation. I'm out of here. Goodbye. That's a timeout, but it's not a good one. The important part of the timeout is, to make it a good one, is you've got to say when you will come back to continue the conversation. So the right way to voice the timeout is to say, okay, listen, I'm getting upset now. I'm getting flooded. I'm getting emotional. I need to take a break. Can we take a break and revisit this in an hour? Or, after dinner, or tomorrow morning, or whenever it makes sense to revisit it, okay? Because when the man just kind of walks away, shuts down and walks away, that leaves the wife feeling abandoned. And women are very sensitive to feelings of abandonment, of loneliness, of not being well cared for. And so that was very triggering and for the woman, and that's going to make things worse. When the wife just kind of walks away, ends the conversation, that leaves the husband feeling pretty disrespected. And men are very sensitive to disrespect, okay? Now, the way to counter both of those is to say, well, I'll be back, and here's when I'll be back. Well, then now the wife is like, okay, I'm not abandoned, and taking a break makes sense, and I know when you come back, and I can plan accordingly. And the wife's like, okay, well, that's a respectful way to treat me, and you care about me, and you respect me, and you want to resolve this issue, and you're coming back, so I'm good with that, okay? So call the timeout, but talk about when you're coming back, all right? So step 1, be soft in how you start the conversation. Use I words, I feel, use the formula. Number 2, learn to make and receive repair attempts. So after the fight, come back, repair the damage, and follow up when you're in these repair attempts with something like, I'm sorry, right? The 6 most important words in the marriage. I'm sorry, I forgive you, okay? It's the power of forgiveness, okay? Soothe yourself and each other. Call the timeout before you come back. All right. Compromise. Step number 4, compromise. And, compromise is the secret to happiness, finding that middle ground, right? And back to what I said earlier, if it's not a sin, give in, right? At the end of the day, is it really that big a deal, whatever you're fighting about? When you really stop and think about it. I mean, probably not, right? You're not talking about should we sell the house or not. Or you're not talking about the fact that I listed the house and, there's a showing on December 24th. At the end of the day, probably what you're arguing about isn't that big a deal, right? And one way to think about that is, so what's the worst that can happen if I give in? We're fighting about, A or B, and my wife wants A and I want B. What's the worst that can happen if we do A? Probably not all that bad, right? So, what's the worst case? That's not all that bad, right? And so here, one of the tools here is the principle of seek first to understand before you seek to be understood, right? So this is this spirit of curiosity. So you want to do A, help me understand why that's important, okay? If it's not a sin, give in, and then pray about it, right? If you're not sure, hop in your car, go over to the nearest adoration chapel and sit there and ask our Lord what you should do. And He'll give you the answer. All right. And then number 5, process any grievances right away so they don't linger. Don't put it off, right? Use the formula right away. I had a couple I was working with, and the husband came in, and they both lived in the Chicago suburbs. They both worked downtown. They rode the same train together every morning. And the husband came in the kitchen one morning to put his shoes on. The wife's backpack was on the chair. He moved the backpack off the chair, put it on the floor, sat down. He's putting his shoes on. The wife walks in the kitchen, sees the backpack on the floor, and loses her mind. I mean, she got so angry that she refused to even ride the same train. I'm not saying wouldn't sit with him, took a later train. Now, how do you get that angry over a backpack that made its way from the chair onto the floor, right? Well, they ended up in my office that night, and I said, well, what's that all about? And she said, Doug, here's the problem. I can't do anything right with this guy. No matter what I do, he redoes it. I don't put my backpack in the right place. He rearranged the silverware drawer because he didn't like where I put the knives and the forks. And I just can't please him, and I can't take it anymore. Well, she had dozens of these little bitty grievances that she didn't address at the time. And they build up till you have this Mount Vesuvius kind of fight. And I know you know what I'm talking about because you've probably done it as well, right? So the idea is use the formula, handle the grievances as soon as they show up when they're small, and then move on, right? So listen, I'm irritated that you moved my briefcase or my backpack onto the floor. And if it's in the wrong place, please put it on another chair. I don't want it to get dirty on the floor or whatever. Handle, kill the little foxes while they're small. This entire episode of Marriage Unhindered is on the updated Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers.